December 23, 1967, 11:47 p.m. Father Patrick McKenzie knelt beside the dying man in the alley behind St. Augustine's Cathedral, making the sign of the cross as he prepared to deliver the last rites for the 200th time in 10 years. Through this holy unction and his own most tender mercy, may the Lord pardon thee whatever sins or faults thou hast committed. The dying man, Vincent the Snake Romano, lieutenant in the Genovese crime family, gripped the priest's hand with what remained of his strength. "Father, I need to tell you something before I die." "What is it, my son?" "This wasn't random. None of them were random. All 200 men you've given last rites to, they were all killed by the same man." Father McKenzie's blood ran cold.
"What are you talking about?"
"Bumpy Johnson. Every man you've blessed as they died, we were all on his list." With his final breath, Vincent Romano revealed the truth that would shatter Father McKenzie's faith and drive him to the edge of madness. For 10 years, he had been unknowingly serving as the unofficial chaplain to Bumpy Johnson's victims. Every late-night emergency call, every dying criminal who coincidentally ended up near St. Augustine's Cathedral, every last confession he'd heard from men who died from street violence, it had all been orchestrated by the most methodical killer in Harlem's history. Father McKenzie had spent a decade believing he was serving God by comforting the dying. The truth was that he'd been serving as the final witness to Bumpy Johnson's systematic elimination of his enemies. To understand how Father Patrick McKenzie became the unwitting accomplice to 200 murders, you need to understand how he came to serve the deadliest neighborhood in New York City. September 15, 1957. Father McKenzie had arrived in Harlem fresh from seminary, assigned to St. Augustine's Cathedral, with a mission to serve the community's spiritual needs. He was 28 years old, idealistic, and determined to bring God's mercy to a neighborhood that seemed forsaken by hope. What he found was a community under siege. Violence was epidemic, poverty was crushing, and death was a constant presence in the streets. Young men died from gunshots, stabbings, and beatings with such regularity that the local morgue couldn't keep pace. But Father McKenzie also found something else, a community that protected its own, led by a man who commanded respect without wearing a uniform or carrying a badge. October 3, 1957, Father McKenzie met Bumpy Johnson for the first time. The meeting happened at 2:30 a.m. when Father McKenzie was called to give last rites to a dying man outside Small's Paradise Jazz Club. When he arrived, he found Bumpy Johnson kneeling beside the wounded man, applying pressure to a chest wound while waiting for the ambulance. "Father, this is Marcus Williams. He's got 3 kids and a wife. He's a good man who made a bad choice tonight." Father McKenzie administered last rites while Bumpy held Marcus's hand. Marcus Williams died at 2:47 a.m., and Father McKenzie said a prayer over his body. "Mr. Johnson, do you know what happened to this man?" "Father, Marcus tried to rob the wrong person, but he's still God's child, and he deserves to die with dignity." That night, Father McKenzie was struck by the contrast. A man who operated outside the law, showing more compassion for the dying than most law-abiding citizens. What Father McKenzie didn't know was that Marcus Williams hadn't tried to rob anyone. He'd been killed on Bumpy's orders for stealing money from community programs that fed hungry children. But Bumpy understood that Father McKenzie would serve the community better if he believed he was helping innocent victims rather than justly executed criminals. November 1957 through December 1967 became 10 years of carefully orchestrated deaths, each one designed to appear random while serving Bumpy's larger strategic purposes. The pattern was always the same. Men who had violated Bumpy's codes of community protection would be found dying near St. Augustine's Cathedral, always with enough time remaining for Father McKenzie to be called for last rites. Some had been selling drugs to children. Others had been extorting local businesses beyond reasonable limits. Some had committed rapes or assaults against community members. A few had been working with federal authorities to destroy Harlem's independent criminal structure. All of them died within a 6-block radius of St. Augustine's Cathedral. All of them died with enough time for Father McKenzie to be summoned. All of them received last rites from a priest who believed he was serving God by comforting random victims of street violence. January 15, 1960. Father McKenzie began keeping detailed records of every man to whom he'd given last rites. It started as a spiritual practice, remembering the dead in his prayers, but it became something more disturbing as patterns emerged. By 1962, Father McKenzie had administered last rites to 89 men. All had died from violence. All had died within the same small area of Harlem. All had died with just enough time for him to be called to the scene. The statistical probability of such clustering was astronomical, but Father McKenzie dismissed his suspicions as paranoid thinking, convincing himself that violence was simply concentrated in certain areas of the neighborhood. March 20th, 1963. Father McKenzie's suspicions became too strong to ignore when he was called to give last rites to Detective Paul Romano, the same Detective Romano who had been investigating Bumpy Johnson for corruption charges. Romano had been found shot outside St. Augustine's Cathedral at 11:30 p.m., with wounds that would take exactly the amount of time necessary for Father McKenzie to arrive and administer last rites. "Father," Detective Romano whispered with his dying breath, "this wasn't random. Bumpy Johnson, he's been..." Romano died before completing the sentence, but Father McKenzie understood what he'd been trying to say. That night, Father McKenzie reviewed his decade of records and confirmed what he'd been trying not to see. Every man to whom he'd given last rites had been connected in some way to investigations or activities that threatened Bumpy Johnson's operations. The realization was devastating. For 6 years, Father McKenzie had been serving not as a minister of God's mercy, but as the final witness to a systematic execution campaign. April 1st, 1963. Father McKenzie requested a meeting with Bumpy Johnson. They met in the same place where they'd first encountered each other 6 years earlier, outside Small's Paradise at 2:30 a.m., beside a dying man who needed last rites. This time, the dying man was Anthony the Fish Torino, and Father McKenzie knew he wasn't there by coincidence. "Mr. Johnson, we need to talk. Father, Anthony here is dying. Maybe we should focus on his spiritual needs." Father McKenzie administered last rites to Anthony Torino, said a prayer over his body, then turned to face Bumpy Johnson directly. "How many, Mr. Johnson? How many what, Father? How many men have you killed who I've given last rites to?" Bumpy studied the priest's face for a long moment. "Father, I've never killed anyone near your cathedral. That's not what I asked, Father. There are a lot of bad men in this neighborhood. Sometimes they make choices that get them killed. When they do, I make sure they die with dignity, near a church where a good priest can help them find peace with God. You arrange for them to die near St. Augustine's, so I'll be called. I arrange for them to die with the possibility of salvation, Father. What they do with that possibility is between them and God." Father McKenzie felt something break inside him. How many have there been, including Anthony? 112. The number hit Father McKenzie like a physical blow. 112 men, over 6 years, all carefully positioned to die near his church so they could receive last rites from a priest who thought he was serving God's mercy. "Why, Mr. Johnson? Why involve me in this? Father, these men committed crimes against this community, against children, families, innocent people. They deserved to die, but they also deserved the chance to make peace with God before they died. You gave them that chance. I was being used. Father, you were serving God by showing mercy to dying men. The fact that those men deserved to die doesn't change the value of the mercy you showed them." That night, Father McKenzie returned to St. Augustine's Cathedral and spent 6 hours on his knees in prayer, trying to understand whether he had been serving God or serving a killer. May 1963 through December 1967 became 4.5 more years of the same pattern. But now Father McKenzie knew the truth. Every emergency call was a summons to witness another execution. Every dying man was another of Bumpy's enemies receiving final justice. But Father McKenzie continued answering the calls, partly because he believed dying men deserved last rites, regardless of how they'd lived, partly because he feared what would happen if he refused to cooperate with Bumpy Johnson, mostly because he had begun to understand that Bumpy's victims truly were men who had harmed the community, drug dealers who sold to children, extortionists who destroyed families, rapists and killers who preyed on innocent people. The moral complexity was overwhelming. A killer who showed mercy to his enemies by ensuring they died with spiritual comfort, administered by a priest who had become an unwilling participant in a decade-long execution campaign. December 23, 1967. Vincent Romano's deathbed confession that Father McKenzie was witnessing his 200th Bumpy Johnson victim marked the end of the arrangement. January 7, 1968. Father McKenzie requested a transfer from St. Augustine's Cathedral. His request was granted, and he was reassigned to a parish in rural New York where violence was rare and death was usually natural. February 7, 1968. Exactly 1 month after Father McKenzie's transfer, Bumpy Johnson died of natural causes in his sleep. The man who had orchestrated 200 deaths over 10 years died peacefully, without violence, without enemies at his bedside. Father McKenzie was not called to give him last rites. March 15, 1968. Father McKenzie attended Bumpy Johnson's funeral. Thousands of Harlem residents filled the streets to pay respects to the man who had protected their community for 30 years. During the funeral service, Father McKenzie realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In 10 years of giving last rites to Bumpy's victims, he had never been called to give last rites to any of Bumpy's innocent victims. Every man who died near St. Augustine's Cathedral had been a criminal who harmed the community. Every man who received last rites had been guilty of crimes that deserved punishment. Bumpy Johnson had killed 200 men over 10 years, but he had killed them selectively, methodically, and with a moral code that protected innocent people while eliminating those who preyed on the vulnerable. Father McKenzie spent the remaining 30 years of his life trying to understand whether he had been an unwitting accomplice to murder or an unknowing instrument of divine justice.